A Pair of Schoolgirls by Angela Brazil. Chapter 15. A Confession. The two girls sank into the pool below, then, rising to the surface, caught with frantic fingers at a rotten willow bough that overhung the water. Neither could swim, and in desperate plight they clung to the frail and insecure support. Almost choked with their dipping, their hair and clothes streaming, they still managed to call vigorously for help. But already their weight was splitting the decayed old willow. There was an ominous crack, a sudden rending, a piteous cry, and, still clutching the severed branch, they went whirling down the river. Mercifully their first wild shriek had been heard, and a farmer who lived at the old mill house by the weir had come running instantly from his garden. He arrived on the scene just as the branch broke, and wading into the water he contrived to catch Dorothy, who was the nearer, and to drag her into safety. But when he turned to look for her companion, Allison had drifted along with the stream, and was out of his reach. He could not swim, so he ran back towards the inn, shouting for help. At the sound of his cries the stable boy and several others came rushing down the field. "Fetch a rope." "Where's the boat?" "Cut a long pole." "She'll drown while you're doing it." "For heaven's sake don't let her go down again." "I can only swim a few strokes, but I'll try if I can reach her," exclaimed the stable boy, flinging off his coat and plunging into the river, which was shallow for a yard or so at the edge. Venturing out of his depth, he grasped Allison by her dress, then turned, floundering hopelessly towards the bank. For a moment it seemed as if both lives must surely be lost, but with a desperate effort the boy managed to keep himself afloat, and to reach the hand of one of the men who had waded out to meet him. Between them they pulled the unconscious girl from the water and laid her on the grass. "She's gone." No, I've seen worse than her as came round." "Take them both into the inn and send Sam in his bike for the doctor." The first intimation of the accident which Miss Carter received was the sight of Dorothy walking dripping wet up the garden, followed by a group of men carrying Allison. She was a woman of sound, practical common sense, and after the first momentary shock was over she set to work at once to administer treatment for the drowning, with the help of the other members of the guild who were present. Their combined efforts were so successful that by the time the doctor arrived they had succeeded in restoring animation. Dorothy, rolled up in hot blankets, was little the worse for her immersion, and did not need attention, but the medical man looked grave when he saw Allison. "She's suffering from severe collapse." "Have you sent for her mother?" he asked. Miss Sherborne and Mrs. Clark had both been summoned by telegram. They drove up within 5 minutes of each other. Poor Mrs. Clark's frantic, white-lipped agony was terrible to witness. "You must save her. She's all I have in the world," she cried, turning desperately, almost fiercely, upon the doctor. "Madam, I use my utmost skill, but life and death are in greater hands than mine," he replied. For many hours Alison's life trembled in the balance. The district nurse had been sent for, and with the doctor watched the case anxiously all night through. At length, when morning dawned, a turn came for the better. "Let her sleep now and she'll do," said Dr. Hall to the nurse. "Can't we get her mother out of the room somehow? Miss Sherborne is downstairs. I know her, and I dare say she will help," suggested the nurse. Aunt Barbara had also spent the night at the inn, partly because she thought it wiser to let Dorothy keep warm in bed, instead of attempting to remove her, and partly because she felt she could not leave till she knew that Alison was out of danger. She had sat up, hoping that she might be of assistance, though she had not liked to intrude her presence into the sick room until she was asked. She came now at the nurse's request, and gently persuaded poor worn-out Mrs. Clark to go downstairs and have some hot tea, which the innkeeper's wife had made ready. "It is better to leave the room in absolute quiet for a while," she said. "Nurse is keeping watch, and indeed the doctor says there is no further cause for anxiety." Mrs. Clark's hand shook as she held her cup. "I can hardly realize yet that she is safe. Oh, if you knew how I have suffered. My head is on fire. I want to go out into the air," she replied pantingly. The light was breaking clearly in the east, and Miss Sherborne opened the front door. The two women stepped together into the garden. "Everything seems quiet," said Mrs. Clark, looking up at Alison's window. "You are sure, if there is the slightest change, that nurse will call me? Then let us walk across the lawn. I want to talk to you. I must speak now, at once, while I have the courage." "Shall we sit here?" said Miss Sherborne, indicating a bench that faced the dawn. The hour was strangely beautiful. The sky, flushing in tints of rose and mauve, heralded the rising sun. The bushes were still masses of rich, warm shadow, but a group of turn-cap lilies stood out fair and golden against the dark background, shedding their heavy fragrance around. A thrush had begun to stir in the laburnum tree, and piped his fine mellow notes, and a blackbird answered from the elm opposite. The world was waking to another day of wonderful, pulsing life. "Weeping and heaviness may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning," murmured Aunt Barbara softly. Mrs. Clark sat for a few moments gazing at the quiet scene. She was still intensely agitated, and kept clasping and unclasping her hands nervously upon her knee. "I must speak," she began again hurriedly. "If I do not tell you now, the resolution may go. When I saw my darling lie there, at the very gate of death, I knew 'twas a judgment upon me for my long silence, my criminal silence." She paused, as if scarcely able to continue. She was weeping bitterly, and her restless fingers pulled to pieces a rose that she had plucked from a bush as she passed. "I hardly know how to explain everything," she went on at last, "but perhaps it will make it clearer if I begin at the beginning, and relate the story of my life. Have you the patience to hear it?" My sister Madeleine and I were twins. My mother died in our infancy, and left no other children, so we two were everything to each other. My father was a clever but eccentric man, a student and an astronomer. He had never been fond of company, and after my mother's death he shut himself up more closely than ever, and became quite a recluse, devoting himself entirely to his books and his telescope. Though he was fond of us in his way, we did not see much of him, and he was always so reserved and silent that we were shy and constrained in his presence. When we were old enough to leave school, our life at home, in a remote country grange, with little society to be had in the neighbourhood, was dull and triste in the extreme. Just after our 21st birthday, we made the acquaintance of two brothers who were staying at a house in the adjoining parish, and the friendship soon ripened into a warmer feeling on both sides. David Clark, the elder, fell in love with my sister Madeleine, and Herbert, the younger, with myself. When we broached the subject to my father, however, he professed great indignation, and forbade either of the young Clarks to come to the house. It was extremely arbitrary and unjust of him to behave thus, for he had no reasonable objections to raise against them. I can only imagine that he was annoyed that he had not been taken earlier into our confidence, and hurt that we wished to leave him. Perhaps, also, he may have had some other matrimonial projects in his mind for us, though he never made the slightest attempt to introduce us to any suitable friends. Can you imagine the situation? Two impulsive, motherless girls in the lonely old house, with no one to counsel us or help to smooth away any of our difficulties. Our lovers had business in India, and were shortly leaving the country, and the idea of parting from them was terrible to us. They pleaded and urged, so what wonder that there were clandestine meetings, and that one morning we took the law into our own hands and made a double runaway match of it. We were both of age, and could therefore legally marry whom each chose. We tried to make peace with our father after the weddings, but he utterly refused to see us, and we were obliged to start for India without having received his forgiveness. Within a year we had news of his death. I think he had been in failing health for some time, and perhaps on that account had been the more loath to part with us, but he had shown us so little tenderness that we had never realized that he wished for our sympathy or affection. Now that I have a child of my own, I regret that I was not a better daughter to him. In his will he showed that he had not pardoned either us or our husbands. He left only a small annuity each to Madeleine and myself, and the bulk of his estate in trust for his first grandchild. My sister Madeleine's little girl was born a fortnight before mine, so it was she, and not Alison, who inherited her grandfather's fortune. I was very angry at the injustice of the proceeding. It seemed to me monstrously unfair that my little one, because she came into the world a fortnight too late, should be deprived of what in all equity ought to have been hers. I was the elder of the twins, and I considered that any preference should have been in my favour. I was anxious to bring a lawsuit, and try to upset the will and cause the estate to be equally divided between my sister and myself, but our solicitor assured me I had no legal case, and should only involve myself in endless proceedings and costs. Madeleine and I were too much attached to each other to have an open quarrel, and before her I managed to hide my bitter disappointment. We were about to be separated, for my husband was returning to England, while hers was still remaining in India. I was thankful afterwards that we had parted on such good terms, for I never saw her again. Only a few days after our steamer started she succumbed to a sudden epidemic of cholera that swept over the place where they were living, and the telegram announcing her death met me at Port Said. I had loved her dearly, and the blow as cruel. But there was a harder one still in store for me. My husband, whose ill health had been the cause of our leaving India, became rapidly worse, and before I even realized the extent of the danger, he too was taken from me. In a single year I had lost father, sister, and husband, and at 23 I found myself a young widow, with an only child. At this juncture my brother-in-law, David Clark, returned to England, bringing his motherless baby in charge of an ayah. He did not intend to stay, only to settle a few necessary business matters and to make some arrangement for his little girl, who was delicate, and could not be reared in India. He had no near relations of his own who were willing to be troubled with the child, so he asked me if I would undertake to bring her up with mine, and I accepted the charge. I was drawn to little Rosamond for her mother's sake, though I could never forgive her for being a fortnight older than her cousin. So everything was settled. I took a house in Scotland for the summer, which I thought would be healthy for the children, and I sent Alison on there in advance with her own nurse. The ayah who had brought Rosamond from India was to return in the same ship as my brother-in-law, who was starting immediately for Madras. He wanted to see his baby till the very last, so I accompanied him to London, taking with me Mrs. Burke, a respectable woman who had once been a maid at my father's house, and was now married, to act as temporary nurse after the ayah's departure. When the last goodbyes were said, and my brother-in-law and the ayah had started, I found I wished to do some shopping in London before I went north. It is awkward and inconvenient to keep a baby at a hotel, so I determined to send Mrs. Burke with my little niece to Scotland, where my own responsible nurse was already settled in charge of Alison. I took them to the station and saw them safely off in the express. In a few days I intended to follow them. That very night, as I sat at dinner in the hotel, I heard the newsboys shouting special edition, and learnt of a terrible Northern Railway smash. I set off by the first available train for the scene of the disaster. It was impossible to get beyond Birkden, for the line was disorganised, but I hired a carriage and went on to Greenfield. The first point to be ascertained was whether my niece was among the victims. I wasted some time enquiring at the railway offices, and it was not till late in the afternoon that I saw a newspaper poster with the heading, "Baby's Wonderful Escape from the Accident." It was only after further investigations and delays that I learned the child was being taken care of by its rescuer at the Red Lion Hotel. Do you remember how I came into the inn parlour that evening? The scene is stamped vividly upon my memory. You sat by the fireside with the baby on your knee. The light falling from the hanging lamp above made a picture of you both. It had taken a fancy to you, though it was always shy with me, and its soft little cheek was pressed against your face. I looked at it, and I think if it had given one sign of recognition, or held out its arms to me, I should have claimed it. But it took no notice at all, and my heart hardened against it. A terrible temptation assailed me. If I disowned the baby, nobody would ever know its identity. It would be so easy to tell its father that it had perished in the fire. There could be no positive evidence about any of the victims of the disaster. If it were out of the way, then my baby would inherit the fortune which I had always considered was my due. I was not left well off, and money meant so much to me. I had not been brought up to study economy, and I hated to be poor. I am a good judge of character, and I knew from your face that you would not abandon the child you had saved. I thought fate had interfered forcibly, and had given it into your keeping instead of mine. At the moment it seemed to me a direct interposition of Providence, and a sign that my father's inheritance was not intended to be lost to me after all. Before me stood a great choice, the good of my sister's little one, or my own, and I chose my own. The sequel proved easy, only too easy. I said the baby I had seen at the inn was not my niece, and nobody doubted my word. My brother-in-law and the Ayah were already on their way to India, Mrs. Burke was dead, and no one else was likely to raise the question of identity. The portrait circulated in the newspapers was such a poor snapshot that neither my nurse nor any of Mr. Clark's relations recognized it. They had not known the child intimately, they had only seen her once or twice in her Ayah's arms. Before I left the Red Lion at Greenfield I ascertained your name. I scarcely knew why, it seemed an instinct at the moment. I wished to forget it, but it remained all the same, one of those things which it is impossible to whine from one's remembrance. Years went by, years of prosperity, for in trust for Alison I was a rich woman. I tried to banish all thoughts of Rosamond, and to justify my action to myself, yet in my inmost heart I knew I had sinned. For some time I lived in the Midlands, but Lemstead did not suit my little girl's health, so I removed to Letchworth. When Alison started to go to the college and I first saw Dorothy in the train, I was immediately struck with her appearance. I could not think of whom she reminded me, her eyes haunted me continually. One day I came home and found that she had been at our house in my absence, and that Alison was full of her resemblance to the portrait of my sister Madeleine which hung in the drawing-room. Then I knew, even without the extra links that made the connection only too plain, the story of her adoption, which Alison had heard at school, the very name of Dorothy Greenfield, and your name, which I had not succeeded in forgetting. Alarmed at the recognition, I forbade Allison to invite her again, and in every way in my power discouraged the acquaintance between the two girls. I thought of removing from Letchworth, but I had taken my house on a lease and spent much on improving it. Everything appeared to conspire against me, first Allison's extreme affection for Dorothy, then our meeting at the Hydro, where my brother-in-law, unaware of her identity, was so charmed with his daughter. Then came Allison's visit to your cottage on the afternoon when I fetched her in the pony trap. I at once recognized your servant as the one I had seen in the inn parlour at Greenfield, and I could tell by her face that she remembered me. It seemed as if fate, whom I thought I had conquered so successfully, was dogging my footsteps. I felt my position was most unsafe, and only yesterday afternoon I definitely decided to sacrifice the improvements I had made at Lindenley and to remove to the south of England, where there would be no further chance of Dorothy crossing our path. As if in direct consequence of my determination followed this terrible accident. It seemed to me like heaven's vengeance on my sin. Was my innocent child to suffer as the scapegoat for my wrongdoing? I vowed to God that if in His mercy He would spare her life, I would make a full confession and reparation, no matter what it cost me. There, I have told you the whole. Do you despise me utterly? Can you possibly ever forgive me that I deliberately thrust the child upon you, and let you bear so heavy a burden all this time? Her own father will be only too thankful to take her now. Miss Sherborne's face was turned towards the golden streak of dawn. For a few moments she was silent. We have both so much to be thankful for this morning, that it makes it easier to forgive, she said at last. Yes, the wrong must be righted, and father and daughter restored to each other, but I am glad I was able to keep my little Dorothy for my own those 14 happy years.